Before the eyes of 200 world leaders, with cameras broadcasting to millions across the globe, Ibrahim Traoré mocked J.D. Vance on live television. His words, sharp as blades, echoed through the summit hall, a calculated insult meant to humiliate, to diminish. The world held its breath, watching the Vice President of the United States stand silent, his gaze steady, his heart pounding beneath the weight of history. But what happened in the next 300 seconds? 5 short minutes, shattered expectations. A man's honor, tested before the judgment of nations, rose to meet the storm. J.D. Vance did not strike back with rage, but with a ruthless truth that broke through the deception and left Traoré's ambitions in ruins. And as the world watched that moment unfold, a single question lingered in countless hearts. What would you have done in his place? Though the story you're about to hear springs from imagination, it reflects truths we all recognize. The burden of leadership, the cost of integrity, the quiet strength it takes to stand firm when the world looks on. What follows is a dramatization, drawn not from headlines but from the timeless struggles of courage and conscience that unite us all. So now step with us into that summit hall and relive the moment that changed everything. Take a breath, lean in, and join us. Because some moments don't just tell a story, they remind us who we are. The Grand Chamber of the World Unity Forum was unlike any room J.D. Vance had stepped into before. It was not just the soaring ceilings or the sea of flags draping the walls, each one representing the hopes, ambitions, and hidden fears of a nation. It was the sheer weight of what this gathering meant and what it could break. Cameras, hundreds of them, lined the upper tiers like watchful sentinels. Their lenses glinted under the cold light, transmitting every breath, every flicker of an eyelid to millions watching across the globe. In that moment, J.D. knew. This wasn't just a summit. It was a stage where history waited to be rewritten, for better or worse. As Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance moved with quiet purpose, his steps measured, his gaze steady. Unlike the grand entrances of some delegates who craved the spotlight, J.D. entered almost unnoticed, his presence calm but firm. The weight of the moment pressed on his shoulders, but his mind was sharper than ever. He scanned the room, not just seeing polished wood and golden emblems, but reading the faces of men and women who held in their hands the fragile threads of global peace. Inside, his thoughts whispered louder than any applause. We come to build peace, or to witness its last breath. The air was thick, not with heat, but with anticipation, the kind that makes even seasoned diplomats sit straighter, adjust their ties, glance at the person beside them as if searching for reassurance. Here were leaders who, behind closed doors, had bartered deals, forged alliances, betrayed one another, now forced to wear masks of civility under the world's gaze. And then there was the tension no one named but everyone felt, the waiting for Ibrahim Traoré. The man from Burkina Faso, once seen as a voice for the powerless, now loomed like a storm cloud over this gathering. His reputation was twofold, savior to some, schemer to others. In back rooms, whispers spoke of what he would say today, of the speech he had rehearsed not once, but 100 times, every word sharpened like a blade. Rumor had it he planned to do more than speak. He planned to ignite. J.D.'s gaze swept across the delegations. He saw ministers exchanging glances, aides scribbling last-minute notes, translators adjusting earpieces. But all eyes ultimately kept darting to the empty seat where Traoré would soon sit, and then to the podium where he would soon stand. Somewhere J.D. could feel it in his bones, the cold certainty that this would not be just another summit of empty words and tired promises. Traoré had come to unsettle the order of things, and J.D. Vance knew instinctively that he would be the target. The first speeches began, ceremonial, polite, filled with talk of unity, progress, hope. Words that sounded hollow against the crackling tension filling the room. J.D. listened, but his mind raced ahead. What was Traoré planning beyond mere words? What trap might already be set? A bead of sweat traced down J.D.'s spine beneath his suit. He could feel the eyes of the cameras, the eyes of the world. And though his face remained calm, his heart beat with the rhythm of an unspoken challenge. Every second that passed felt longer than the last. Every glance, every breath in the chamber seemed to hang suspended. As the final speaker before Traoré stepped down, the room shifted, not physically but in spirit, a collective inhale, and then came the sound, the soft shuffle of footsteps as Ibrahim Traoré rose from his seat, his figure tall, his expression unreadable. The storm was about to break, and J.D. Vance, standing at the edge of history's cliff, braced for what was coming, knowing that whatever unfolded next would be remembered, debated, and felt for years to come. The soft shuffle of Traoré's footsteps echoed louder than the polite applause that greeted him. It wasn't the sound itself, but what it carried, a weight of expectation, of calculated intent, like the first rumble of a storm that all had sensed, but none dared name aloud. His stride was slow, deliberate, as if he savored the moment, as if every eye upon him fed his power. The grand chamber seemed smaller now, not because of its walls, but because of the force that Traoré's presence commanded the instant he took the podium. The light caught his face just so, half in shadow, half in the glare of 100 cameras. His expression? Calm, almost warm, but with an edge so sharp it could cut stone. A man well practiced in the art of public spectacle, he waited just for a breath, letting silence do what words could not. Seize the room. Even the hum of translators' headsets seemed to falter. Then his voice rose, smooth as polished steel, steady as the tick of a clock, but beneath it, a venom that coiled with each syllable. My friends, my colleagues, my brothers and sisters in the struggle for dignity, he began, and for a moment it felt like an ordinary speech, the kind that opened summits and closed them with nothing but polite nods. But then, without warning, the storm broke. The United States, under this vice president, he said, his gaze sweeping the chamber and landing squarely on J.D. Vance, has funded violence on African soil. A gasp rippled through the hall, genuine, unguarded, the kind of sound that no protocol could silence. Traoré did not pause. He pressed on, voice rising, not in volume, but in righteous fury. The blood of my brothers, he said, is on his hands. Journalists erupted into motion, pens flying, fingers pounding at keyboards, cameras zooming, shutters clicking in a furious rhythm that matched the racing of JD's heart. The room that had been filled with cautious anticipation was now charged, electric, dangerous. J.D. Vance sat still. Outwardly, he was the image of composure, shoulders square, face unreadable, gaze steady. But inside, his pulse thudded, his mind racing through the implications of each word. This wasn't just an insult. This was a calculated strike, designed to isolate him, to make him a villain before the eyes of the world. He could feel it, the shift in the room, the subtle leaning away of some allies, the glances exchanged among delegations, as if already weighing how this accusation might serve their own ends. Traoré continued, weaving his accusations into a tapestry of outrage and moral superiority. He named villages, recounted atrocities, each detail dripping with the suggestion, the insistence, that J.D. and through him, the United States, was to blame. His voice was a weapon, and he wielded it with precision honed over years of political battle. And yet, beneath the venom, there was calculation. Traoré wasn't just speaking to the room, he was speaking to the world beyond it, to every home watching, to every heart that longed for a villain to blame for their suffering. The transition was seamless, from the charged silence of his rise to the storm of his words. And so too was JD's own resolve hardening within. He knew in that moment that the truth would have to be stronger than the fury now aimed at him. And as Traoré's final words rang out, "Will we let this go unanswered, my friends? Or will we stand for justice?" J.D. felt the weight of history settle even more heavily on his shoulders, but he did not flinch. Not yet, not here, because in the storm's eye there is always a stillness before the answer comes. The final echoes of Traoré's words had barely faded before the storm outside the chamber broke loose. Within seconds, the corridors of the summit buzzed with a new, dangerous energy. News wires flared to life. Headlines were already forming in real time, bold, unforgiving, and hungry for sensation. Traoré accuses U.S. of funding bloodshed. Vice President silent in face of damning claims. On television screens in press rooms and hotel lobbies across the globe, commentators seized the moment. Their voices, sharp and eager, filled the airwaves. "You saw it," one analyst said, his tone dripping with certainty. J.D. Vance said nothing, and silence at a moment like this speaks volumes. Another chimed in, the kind who thrived on outrage. If he had nothing to hide, why didn't he deny it on the spot? The camera angles, chosen so carefully by the networks, replayed the scene on loop. Traoré's fire, JD's stillness. Again and again, as if stillness were proof of guilt. Inside the summit hall, the murmur of voices rose to a low roar as delegates huddled in whispered conversations, glances darting toward JD as if he might break his composure at last. But he did not. He remained seated, spine straight, eyes forward, though beneath the surface his thoughts churned like a sea in storm. The weight of accusation, JD reflected, is heavy, but not as heavy as the truth it seeks to crush. He could feel it pressing on him, not just the eyes of the chamber, but of the world beyond it. This was a test of more than just politics. This was a test of character, of conviction. He had come here in good faith, believing in the power of diplomacy, in the promise of reason. And now he stood at the center of a storm built from lies, half-truths, and the raw hunger of men like Traoré, who thrived in chaos. His pulse was steadying now, his mind clearer with each passing moment. The first shock had hit, but J.D. Vance was not a man to be undone by words alone. He knew that the storm would pass, and when it did, the world would look to see what truth remained standing. A soft voice broke into his thoughts. His national security aide, a man J.D. trusted like few others, leaned in just enough for J.D. to hear, his tone low but certain. "We have what you need," he whispered. The words carried no triumph, only the weight of responsibility. "But timing will be everything." J.D. didn't turn to look at him. He didn't have to. His reply was in the faintest nod, in the resolve that sharpened his gaze. He knew what his aide meant. The truth, like a blade, had to be drawn at just the right moment. Not too soon, lest it be lost in the noise. Not too late, lest the damage be done beyond repair. Around him, the hall's chaos swirled on. Delegates debating, journalists speculating, cameras still fixed on his face, hungry for any crack, any slip. But J.D. Vance sat steady in the storm's eye, holding tight to what mattered most. The knowledge that the right answer, the real answer, would come. And when it did, it would not need to shout. It would speak for itself. The storm outside the chamber had gathered force. Within hours of Traoré's speech, global headlines screamed betrayal. "America's dark hand exposed," blared one major network. "U.S. Vice President implicated in African bloodshed," declared another, as if accusation alone were proof enough. Screens from New York to Nairobi replayed the moment Traoré's words struck, and J.D. Vance's silence followed. It didn't matter that silence had been wisdom, restraint, or the weight of calculation. In the court of instant judgment, it was treated as confession. Commentators dissected every frame, every angle, as if truth could be found between the lines of J.D.'s unmoving face. His choice to wait, to measure the storm before responding, became the story's fuel. "He had nothing to say because he had no defense," one pundit declared with certainty, his voice echoing across newsrooms and living rooms alike. If he were innocent, wouldn't he have spoken? It wasn't just the media. The tremors rippled through the diplomatic ranks as well. Behind the closed doors of side meetings and late-night calls, allies grew uneasy. Some came quietly in corridors and private chambers, their faces tight with concern. A European minister whom J.D. had once counted as a trusted partner drew him aside, his voice low but urgent. "J.D., what are you hiding?" he asked, not with accusation, but with the fear of a man desperate to protect a fragile alliance. "If there's something we should know, tell me now, before this breaks us all." J.D. looked into the man's eyes that had seen too many deals forged on fragile ground, too many promises broken. He wanted to answer, to explain, to lay bare the truth, waiting for its moment. But he knew that to speak now would be to waste the truth's power. to let it drown in the noise. So he held the line. "You'll know what you need to know," he said quietly, "when the time is right." The minister's gaze searched his for a flicker of doubt, found none, and with a weary nod, turned away. Outside the summit walls, the unrest grew louder. Protesters filled the avenues surrounding the venue, their voices rising in angry chorus. Some called for justice, some for JD's resignation, some merely for someone to blame in a world where outrage came easier than answers. Their banners waved above the sea of faces. "Hands off Africa. End American imperialism. Traoré stands for us." JD walked past them, the weight of their fury pressing against him like the heat of the noonday sun. Every chant, every sign felt like another stone added to the burden he carried. But he did not let it slow his step. He moved with purpose, with quiet resolve, his gaze steady on the path ahead. Inside, he felt the sting of being misunderstood, of watching his restraint twisted into guilt, his silence into surrender. And yet beneath that sting burned something fiercer: determination. J.D. Vance knew what the world did not yet see. He knew that truth, real truth, is patient. It waits for its moment, and when that moment comes, it does not need to shout to be heard. As he reached the summit doors once more, the roar of the crowd behind him faded into the background, overtaken by the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Steady, certain, ready. The night had fallen heavy on the summit city, its streets quieting under the weight of the day's chaos. The roar of protest outside the venue had ebbed into a restless murmur, the kind that doesn't bring peace, only pause. Inside his quarters, J.D. Vance stood at the tall window, watching the flicker of distant camera lights, the glow of banners still raised against him. The echoes of their chants lingered, even here, in this momentary stillness. And yet it wasn't the noise outside that kept sleep at bay. It was the questions, the storm within. A soft knock broke the quiet, and before J.D. could speak, his national security advisor entered, carrying not the weariness of the day, but a sharpness, a purpose. The man's expression told J.D. that the moment he'd been waiting for had arrived, or at least its first hint. Without preamble, the advisor crossed the room and set down a secured tablet on the table between them. "We have something," he said, voice low but urgent. J.D. turned, his eyes narrowing, his mind instantly sharpening as he approached. The advisor tapped the screen, and a grainy video flickered to life, audio faint at first, then clear enough to chill the blood. J.D. watched, heart steady, as shadows in some far-off room plotted with dangerous ease. A man J.D. recognized as one of Traoré's close operatives spoke in measured tones about targets, about violence that would be staged, about blame to be placed squarely on foreign hands, American hands. For a long moment after the clip ended, J.D. said nothing. The room seemed to pulse with the enormity of what he'd seen. The proof was there. The weapon Traoré had sought to forge against him could be turned, cleanly, decisively, devastatingly. But as his advisor looked at him, waiting for a command, J.D. felt the weight of more than opportunity. He felt the weight of responsibility. He sat, leaning forward, elbows on the table, hands steepled before him. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "Truth is power," he said, almost to himself, "but power without honor is tyranny." His advisor shifted, uncertain. "Sir, this is what they won't expect. You've been on defense. This puts us on offense. We can stop Traoré's game before it destroys what we've built." J.D. nodded slowly, absorbing the logic, the temptation of striking now, while the world's gaze was fixed, while Traoré's mask could be torn away. But inside he wrestled with the deeper question. Not could they act, but should they, and when? "The world's watching," J.D. said at last, gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the walls, beyond the night. "And not just what we reveal, but how we reveal it. The truth must do more than clear my name. It must heal what this man seeks to tear apart." The advisor studied him for a beat, then quietly retrieved the tablet. "We'll be ready when you are," he said simply. J.D. stayed at the table long after the door closed behind his aide, the city's lights flickering against the dark glass. The burden was heavier now, but so too was the resolve taking shape within him. The right truth at the right time could change everything. But timing would demand more than strategy. It would demand honor and the courage to wait for the moment when truth could stand on its own, unclouded by fury or revenge. And so the night stretched on, silent but charged, as J.D. Vance prepared not for battle, but for justice. The dawn came gray and heavy, as if even the sky bore the weight of the lies now spreading across the globe. J.D. Vance had known that Traoré would not stop with accusations alone. Men like him never did. But even he had not expected the speed, the precision with which the next blow would fall. By mid-morning, the first leaks began to surface. Carefully selected media outlets received what appeared to be classified documents, files stamped and sealed, purporting to expose U.S. involvement in operations that destabilized regions across Africa. The headlines flared again, brighter, sharper, more damning than before. Secret files reveal U.S. hand in African conflicts. Leaked memos, J.D. Vance authorized covert actions. The documents, of course, were forgeries. Clever, detailed, laced with just enough truth to make the lie hard to untangle. But in the court of public opinion, where complexity was often drowned out by outrage, that hardly mattered. In their secure briefing room, J.D. and his team pored over the materials, the room tense with unspoken fury. His communications chief slammed a folder shut. "This is poison. By the time we disprove one page, they'll have printed 10 more. J.D. listened, calm on the outside, though his pulse beat hard beneath the surface. The storm was gathering its full force now. The calls from uneasy allies came faster. The media demands louder. The protests outside fiercer. Traoré's strategy was working, not because it was right, but because it was relentless. And yet, as the room debated countermeasures, as tempers flared and voices rose, J.D. lifted a hand. The room fell quiet, awaiting his word. "We won't play his game," J.D. said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "We don't need to outshout him. We don't need to drown him in denials. We need to let the world see the truth for itself and choose it." His national security advisor nodded slowly. "You want to wait for the moment?" J.D. met his gaze. "No, I want to make the moment. A truth revealed cleanly can't be twisted. If we move too soon, it'll be lost in this noise. If we wait too long, we'll lose the ground entirely. So we plan, carefully, completely. We don't destroy Traoré. We destroy the lie." The team fell into thoughtful silence, the shift in strategy sinking in. This would not be a war of press releases or rapid-fire rebuttals. It would be something harder and far more powerful. A battle not for victory, but for clarity. Outside, the protests surged, their chants rising like waves against the walls of diplomacy. Inside, J.D. Vance and his team set to work, not with the fury of men wronged, but with the resolve of those who knew that truth, when revealed at the right time, would need no defense. And as they began to shape their plan, J.D. felt a quiet certainty take root within him. The storm would rage, but when it cleared, only one thing would be left standing: the truth. The hours that followed felt longer than days. Outside the summit's towering walls, the protests grew louder, more organized, their chants now echoing in every hallway, like the steady drumbeat of accusation. Inside, the storm J.D. Vance had predicted unfolded with ruthless efficiency. Where once handshakes and nods of quiet support had greeted him, now there were cold glances, sidelong looks, and polite but pointed distance. He saw it in the way ministers who'd once sought him out now huddled together, whispering behind folders and half-raised hands. He felt it in the way conversations hushed when he entered a room. He heard it in the strained silences where allies once spoke words of reassurance. J.D. knew the language of power, and he understood that silence could be as loud as condemnation. In the mid-afternoon haze of the summit chamber, a private meeting was hastily arranged. A European leader, one J.D. had considered a friend and a steadfast partner, drew him aside away from the cameras but not from the weight of the moment. The man's face was drawn, his eyes tired from the sleepless nights the crisis had already cost him. "J.D.," he began, voice low but edged with urgency. "You need to clear this up, now before it's too late, before you lose us." The words, though spoken softly, struck harder than any of Traoré's accusations. JD met the man's gaze, seeing not betrayal but desperation, the fear of a world order crumbling, of alliances fraying beyond repair. He wanted to answer with the truths he carried, the proofs his team was assembling, piece by piece, but the time had not come. Not yet. "I will," JD said, his voice measured, steady. "But I'll do it the right way. You'll see." The European leader searched his eyes for a crack, for hesitation, for anything that might suggest JD doubted his course. Finding none, he nodded once tightly and turned away, the weight of his own nation's anxieties pressing him forward. Left alone in the quiet after, JD stood for a long moment, watching the flow of delegates beyond the glass. They moved with purpose, with caution, with calculation. And for the first time, JD felt the full measure of isolation that leadership sometimes demanded. What's honor worth, his mind whispered, when allies walk away? The question wasn't born of doubt, but of weariness. The weariness of a man who chose the harder path and now bore its cost. He thought of the truth he guarded, of the proof waiting for its hour. He thought of the cost of rushing, of letting desperation dictate action, and he thought, too, of the cost of waiting too long. But in that quiet moment, something else stirred within him, a reminder that the measure of a leader was not taken in the applause of friends, nor in the approval of the moment. It was taken in the courage to stand alone, when alone was the right place to be. The storm outside raged on. Inside, JD Vance gathered his resolve, not against the world, but for it, because the truth he held was not his alone to defend. It was the world's to witness when the moment was right. The isolation pressed on JD as he left the glass-walled corridor behind, the weight of that European warning still echoing in his mind. But he did not let it sway him. Instead, it strengthened his resolve as he stepped into the secure briefing room where his most trusted advisors waited. Their faces reflected the storm outside, tense, determined, but searching for answers, for leadership, for the right course forward. The room fell silent as JD entered, not out of formality, but because they knew this was no ordinary meeting. The time for theory was over. Now came the time for choice. Maps and documents littered the long table. Screens glowed with real-time feeds, protests swelling outside the summit, headlines scrolling endlessly with accusations and speculation, diplomatic messages blinking with increasing urgency. The air inside the room was thick, not just with worry, but with the knowledge that whatever decision they made tonight could shape what the world would believe tomorrow. One of JD's senior aides, a woman with decades of hard-won diplomatic scars, spoke first. "We need to release the recording now. The longer we wait, the deeper the damage. Every hour, Traoré's lies harden into truth in the public mind." A younger advisor, his voice taut with frustration, added, "He's framing you, sir, framing this nation. We can't let him control the narrative. Strike back, now." JD listened, his expression thoughtful, absorbing their words without interruption. He saw the urgency in their eyes, the fear of losing the ground entirely, and yet beneath that fear he sensed something else, the temptation to act from anger, from wounded pride, from the need to stop the bleeding at any cost. He straightened, hands resting on the table, gaze steady as it swept the room. "I hear you, and I understand the need to act. But understand this, the right truth at the wrong time is just another lie." The room held its breath, the words settled like stone, firm and unyielding. JD continued, his tone calm but resolute. "If we act in haste, if we throw this proof into the storm of noise Traoré has created, it will be twisted, drowned, lost. We can't out-shout him. We can only outlast him. We reveal what we have when the world is ready to hear it, when the lie is so loud, so grotesque, that the truth shines through clean and undeniable." A murmur of understanding moved through the room. The tension didn't vanish. The stakes remained immense. But now there was clarity in their path. JD wasn't asking them to wait out of weakness, but out of strength, out of a determination to let the truth speak on its own terms, not theirs. His national security advisor leaned forward, voice low but supportive. "Then we prepare. We position everything so that when you strike, sir, it's final. No room for doubt, no room for spin." JD nodded once sharply. Exactly. This isn't about saving me. This is about saving the integrity of what we represent, and that means patience, no matter how hard it gets. As the team turned to the work ahead, JD felt the weight of leadership settle heavier on his shoulders, but also the quiet strength that came with knowing he had chosen not the easiest road, but the right one. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside this room, the path forward was clear and waiting for its moment. The hours that followed were a masterclass in restraint. JD Vance and his team worked quietly behind closed doors, preparing, watching, waiting. Outside, the storm of outrage continued to swirl, but inside that briefing room, there was purpose, discipline, and a hard-won patience that came from knowing the truth would only have one chance to be heard. And it had to be heard right. But patience, as JD knew too well, often draws out desperation in those who thrive on chaos. And desperation was exactly what revealed itself next. Traoré, sensing that his campaign of accusation was losing steam against JD's unshaken resolve, reached further, too far. In a sudden, stunning move, he called a press conference at the summit, hastily arranged, the room packed with journalists hungry for the next sensational headline. Cameras jostled for position, microphones crowded the podium like vultures circling a prize. When Traoré stepped up, the mask of dignity he had worn so well began to slip. His eyes burned with the fire of a man who knew his moment was slipping through his fingers. And then, with a voice loud enough to fill the chamber, but thin with overreach, he leveled his most shocking accusation yet. "I stand before you," he declared, "having uncovered a plot so vile it defies belief. Even as I speak, agents of the United States, under the direction of Vice President J.D. Vance, have conspired to silence me, through assassination, here at this summit." The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Cameras whirred to life. The words were so extreme, so beyond reason, that for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop, suspended between disbelief and the irresistible pull of scandal. JD, watching the broadcast from his secured chamber, felt the impact like the crack of thunder, not because he feared the claim, but because he saw in it the danger of a lie pushed beyond its limits. He saw how easily outrage could be weaponized, how quickly chaos could spread when truth was buried beneath fear. But he also saw something else, the moment he had been waiting for. The tension in the room where JD stood was razor sharp. His team exchanged looks, some of shock, some of grim confirmation. The national security advisor turned to JD, voice low. "He's overplayed. The world will see this for what it is." JD didn't answer at first. His gaze was fixed on the screen, on Traoré's face as the man doubled down on his claims, his voice rising, his words losing coherence as passion overtook strategy. Then slowly, JD exhaled, his decision crystallizing in the stillness of that breath. "This is it," JD said, his voice steady. The storm inside him settled into resolve. "Get everything ready. The final move begins now." As his team sprang into motion, JD stood taller, his mind clear. Traoré had cast the last stone, and with it had shattered the illusion of control he'd so carefully built. The moment for truth had come, and JD Vance would not let it pass. The storm had moved inside now, quieter on the streets below, but raging still in the hearts of those caught in its path. Traoré's final, reckless accusation hung in the air, like the last clap of thunder before a heavy, expectant silence. And in that silence, JD Vance stood alone on a narrow balcony high above the city, the cold night air brushing against his face, the distant hum of a sleepless world beneath him. The city stretched out before him, lights flickering like scattered embers, the grand avenues and dark alleyways alike bound together by the fragile peace he'd sworn to protect. From this vantage, the protests that had shaken the day felt far away, their chants muted, their banners unseen. But JD knew better than to be comforted by distance. The real battle was not in the streets. It was in the hearts and minds of those who watched, waited, and wondered what kind of man he truly was. He leaned against the railing, hands braced on the cold iron, his breath a quiet cloud in the night. His thoughts wandered, not to strategy or speeches, but to the people who had shaped him, to the lessons that steadied him now. He thought of his grandfather, the steelworker, a man of few words but unshakable principles. The memory came easily. A younger JD, no more than 10, standing in the dim light of the old mill at dusk. His grandfather's massive hand rested on his shoulder as they looked out over the machinery that had built a town, fed families, forged futures. "You see that, boy?" the old man had said, his voice deep, roughened by time and work. "Steel don't lie. It bends, it takes the heat, but it don't break easy. And when it does, it tells you straight. No hiding it, no pretending." JD had nodded, wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of it. His grandfather had crouched to meet his gaze. "Be like that steel, son. You'll face heat. You'll be bent. But don't break for anyone, and don't ever pretend to be what you're not, because when the heat's on, that's when a man shows what he's made of." The memory warmed JD even now, decades later, standing alone with the weight of nations on his shoulders. He wondered what his grandfather would say if he could see this night. This battle fought not with hammers and fire, but with words and wills and truths twisted beyond recognition. The fragile line between justice and revenge, JD thought, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first hints of dawn would soon appear. That line had never felt thinner. The temptation to strike, to answer outrage with outrage, was real, fierce, and human. But honor was not found in fury. It was found in the stillness between storms, in the choice to stand firm when the easy path lay elsewhere. Inside, his team worked, preparing for the final move. But out here, in this quiet moment, JD reminded himself who he was and why he fought. Not for vengeance, not for pride, but for the simple, unshakable belief that truth, like steel, must be shaped with care, revealed with purpose, and never wielded in anger. As the city slept, JD Vance stood watch, ready for the dawn. The first hints of dawn began to creep across the horizon, casting a pale glow through the summit's quiet corridors. JD Vance stepped back inside, leaving behind the stillness of the night and the weight of his grandfather's lesson. There was no time left for reflection. The moment of action was near. His team was waiting, and the final pieces of truth were ready to be placed. In the secure conference room, the atmosphere had shifted. Gone was the frustration, the weariness of men and women battered by days of slander and suspicion. In its place was a steady, sharpened focus. Screens glowed softly in the dim light. Files spread across the table like the fragments of a puzzle finally ready to be assembled. JD entered without ceremony, taking his seat at the head of the table. His national security advisor met his gaze with a quiet nod and tapped the screen nearest him. The room fell silent as the recording played. The full recording at last. The grainy video showed a private meeting, faces partially obscured, but voices clear. Traoré's operative spoke first, laying out the plan in chilling detail. The staged violence, the false trails, the intent to blame the United States. And then, unmistakably, Traoré's own voice entered the frame, calm, precise, deadly in its calculation. He gave the final orders, the instructions to ensure the operation's success, to ensure that blame fell squarely where he wanted it, on JD Vance, on America. When the clip ended, the room held its breath. The proof was undeniable, devastating in its clarity. The lie that had wrapped itself around the summit, around JD's name, around his nation, was laid bare. But the question remained, how to wield this truth so that it could not be twisted, so that it could cut cleanly through the fog of accusation and deceit. JD looked around the table, reading the resolve in his team's eyes. It was his communications chief who spoke first, her voice steady but carrying the emotion that filled them all. This isn't about saving face anymore. It's about saving truth itself. JD nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his own resolve. Exactly, he said. This was never about me. This was about something larger, something that must stand long after we're gone. His advisor leaned forward. We have the timeline, the strategy. We can release this in a way that no one, not Traoré, not the media, not any opportunist, can distort. The world will see what's real. They'll see it all. JD's gaze was firm, his voice low but certain. Then that's what we do. No spin, no spectacle, just the truth. Let it speak for itself. The plan began to take final shape. Carefully, deliberately, each detail mapped out. The delivery of the evidence, the timing, the messaging that would accompany it. Not defensive, not aggressive, but clear, steady, unflinching. They would not match Traoré's fury. They would rise above it. Outside, the city stirred, unaware that within these walls the moment of reckoning was being forged. Inside, J.D. Vance felt the quiet power of certainty take hold. The storm was about to break, and when it did, the truth would no longer be a weapon in a game of power. It would be the light that ended the darkness. The plan was set, the path chosen, yet as the final strategy meeting dissolved into quiet nods and purposeful steps, J.D. Vance remained seated at the table, alone, the weight of what lay ahead pressing on him more deeply than ever. The recording was no longer a question, no longer a piece to debate. It was the key that could end this crisis, but only if wielded with the care and honor it demanded. The city beyond the windows had slipped into the last dark hush before dawn, the hour when even the most restless souls briefly found pause. J.D. knew that when the sun rose, the world would change. The storm that had gathered, swirled, and struck would finally meet its reckoning. But here, in this fragile moment between night and day, there was still space for one final act. A private act, unseen by cameras or advisors, but perhaps the most important of all. J.D. reached for a simple notepad, its pages clean, unmarked by the calculations of politics or the tactics of diplomacy. He drew a pen from his jacket and for a long moment simply stared at the blank paper, listening to the silence that filled the room like a quiet prayer. Then, in a hand steady despite the storm within, he wrote, "If I fall tomorrow, let it be for what's right." The words stared back at him, stark in their simplicity, profound in their finality. They were not meant for the history books, not for speeches or headlines. They were meant for himself, a promise, a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he had refused to rush to rage, why he had chosen to trust in truth rather than fury. He set the pen down gently, folded the page, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. A small gesture, perhaps, but one that felt as solid as steel. Leaving the briefing room, J.D. made his way to the modest suite that had been his refuge these long nights. The corridors were empty now, the hum of the summit paused, as if the building itself held its breath for what dawn would bring. In his room, he shed the jacket and sat at the edge of the bed, staring out at the first pale glimmers of light creeping into the sky. Sleep came slowly, fitfully. Each time he closed his eyes, fragments of the coming day played behind them. The moment the recording would be released, the faces of leaders as truth shattered lies, the hope that honor would outlast the storm. He shifted, turned, but the weight of what was coming kept rest at bay. Still, in those broken hours of rest, J.D. found a kind of peace. The decision had been made. The course was set. And whatever came with the dawn, he knew he would meet it not with fear, not with regret, but with the certainty that he had chosen what was right. Outside, the first rays of sun began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in golden gray. Inside, J.D. Vance slept lightly, the promise of that folded note resting close to his heart. Dawn broke with a pale, uncertain light that seemed to match the mood of the summit city. The air carried a strange stillness, as if the world, knowing what this day would bring, paused to witness it. Inside the grand chamber of the World Unity Forum, that stillness shattered the moment the session resumed. Cameras flashed like lightning. The press surged forward, hungry for the next headline. Delegates filled their seats, the hum of translation headsets blending with the low murmur of uneasy conversation. But above all, there was one undeniable fact. All eyes were on J.D. Vance. He entered quietly as he always did, but there was no hiding now. No more waiting in the wings. Today, the world's gaze followed him with the weight of judgment. Some eyes burned with accusation, others with hope, many with the wary look of those who feared what truth might demand of them. J.D. felt it, but he let none of it alter his step. He moved with purpose, with calm, with the certainty of a man who had chosen his path and would see it through. And then, before JD could take his place, Traoré rose. The room quieted at once, the way it does when a storm returns after a moment's respite. Traoré stood tall at the podium, his voice steady but sharp as a blade honed too thin. He wasted no time. "I come before you today," Traoré began, "to speak what must be spoken. Though I know the powerful will call it defiance." His eyes swept the room, pausing for effect before landing on JD. "This summit has been stained by deceit. We have been made to gather under the shadow of betrayal. The Vice President of the United States stands accused not only of crimes against my people, but of conspiring to silence me. Here, on this stage, in this hall of peace." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Pens flew across notepads. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression. Traoré's words grew more forceful, his accusations more sweeping. He demanded accountability. He demanded JD's resignation. He painted a portrait of villainy so complete it left little room for reason, or so he hoped. When he finished, the room seemed to hold its breath. The moment had come. JD Vance rose. He walked to the podium with measured steps, feeling the tension in the air, the weight of what was at stake. But when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, no defensiveness. It carried only truth, quiet, steady, and unshakable. "I have heard the charges against me," JD began, his gaze sweeping the room as Traoré's had, but with none of the fury. "I have listened as my name, my office, my nation have been called into question, and I stand before you now not to deny our imperfections. America is not flawless. We have erred. We have fallen short. And like all great nations, we strive to do better, not because we are forced to, but because we believe it is our duty." He paused, letting the words settle. The room, so noisy moments ago, was silent now. "I will not answer outrage with outrage," JD continued. "I will not trade accusation for accusation. But I will speak plainly. Justice is not served by lies, nor is peace built upon slander. Today I will share with you not defenses or denials, but the truth, unvarnished, unspun, unshaken." As he stepped back from the podium, the tension did not break. It tightened, sharpened, as the world waited for what would come next. JD Vance had set the moral stage. Now the truth would speak for itself. The air in the chamber was charged now, so thick with tension it seemed to hum. JD Vance stood motionless at the podium for a moment longer, letting his words linger in the silence that followed. Then, with a single measured nod, he signaled his team. There was no grand gesture, no theatrics, just that quiet signal, and suddenly the world changed. The lights dimmed slightly as the screens around the hall flickered to life. The delegates, the press, the millions watching from afar leaned in instinctively, drawn toward what they sensed was no ordinary presentation. For days they had heard accusations, witnessed denials, absorbed spin. But now the room itself seemed to shift as the promise of truth finally took shape. The recording began. The video was grainy, the sound imperfect. But what it showed needed no polish. There, in some shadowed room, Traoré's operative outlined the plan in chilling detail. His voice was calm, precise, as he spoke of staged attacks, of evidence planted to frame American hands. He detailed the steps that would ensure blame fell on the United States, the moves that would ignite outrage and fracture alliances. And then came the voice that froze the room, Traoré himself, clear, unmistakable. His tone was measured, deliberate, as he gave the final orders. Instructions to ensure the plot's success. To tie the lie so tightly that truth would struggle to breathe. He spoke not with the fury he had shown at the podium, but with cold calculation, the voice of a man who believed himself untouchable. Gasps broke the silence. A ripple of shock spread through the chamber like a sudden wind. Reporters who had come ready to dissect another speech now sat wide-eyed, stunned, their pens forgotten, their cameras capturing not bluster or scandal, but history in the making. Delegates who had avoided JD's gaze now turned toward him, faces pale, expressions stricken. The recording played to its end, leaving nothing to doubt, nothing to debate. It spoke plainly, powerfully, with a force no speech could match. And when the screen went dark, the silence that followed was deeper than any that had come before. JD let it stand. He did not rush to fill it with words, did not seek to drive the point home. The truth had spoken and it needed no help. He stood steady, allowing the weight of what had been revealed to settle fully across the room, across the world. Cameras continued to roll, capturing not just the moment of revelation, but the faces of those forced to reckon with it. Traoré, who had stood so tall and defiant minutes before, now sat frozen. The mask he had worn cracked beyond repair. His hands, once raised in righteous fury, trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table before him. JD's team waited, watching, ready to act at his signal. But JD held still, his heart steady. This was the moment they had prepared for. Not a moment of victory, not a moment for gloating, but a moment for truth to stand on its own, undeniable and unshaken. And as the chamber remained silent, the world watched and saw and knew. For a breathless instant, the chamber remained frozen in that heavy, unbroken silence. The recording's final words seemed to linger in the air, as if the truth itself refused to be hurried away by the noise of the world. J.D. Vance stood steady, unmoving, letting the weight of what had been revealed settle into every corner of the room, every heart and mind present. The stillness was profound, the kind that only truth, stark and undeniable, could create. And then, the inevitable came. Traoré, once the master of the room, the architect of outrage, the man who had commanded the world's attention with his fiery accusations, now found himself adrift in a sea of faces that no longer believed. His composure cracked. His voice, once so commanding, faltered. "This is fabrication," he said at first. His words rushed, his tone strained. "A forgery made to discredit a voice of justice." He rose from his seat, his hands raised as if to summon back the authority he had lost. But no one moved. No one nodded in agreement. The room remained still, eyes fixed on him, not with admiration or loyalty, but with the cold clarity that only truth can bring. The denial gave way to anger. His voice rose, trembling not with righteous fury now, but with desperation. "You think this changes what you are? What America is? This is theater. Lies layered upon lies." His fist pounded the table once, twice, a hollow sound that echoed too loud in the quiet room. But still no one answered. Finally the rage ebbed, leaving in its place something smaller, something sadder. Traoré's shoulders sagged, his voice softened, the fire gone. "We can find peace," he said, his words almost a plea. "We can move past this. I was forced. There were pressures. You must see that. We can work together for what is right." It was too late. The faces that met his were unchanged. No longer hostile, simply done. The moment for listening had passed. The world had heard what mattered. JD remained at the podium, watching, listening, his heart steady, his mind clear. When he spoke at last, his words were quiet, but they filled the space with the finality of a closing chapter. Let truth be its own judgment. There was nothing more to say. The room shifted then, as if released from a spell. Journalists erupted into motion, voices rising, cameras flashing, pens flying across pages. Headlines were already forming, destined for screens and front pages within minutes. Traoré exposed. A new chapter begins. From accuser to disgrace, the fall of a firebrand. J.D. Vance's moment of truth. Outside, the first wave of reports reached the protesters. Chants faded, confusion spreading as new facts broke through the fog of outrage. The storm that had shaken the summit for days began, at last, to lose its fury. J.D. stepped down from the podium, his team falling in beside him, the weight of the past days slowly lifting as the truth took its rightful place in the light. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction in Traoré's fall. There was only relief and the quiet strength of a man who had chosen at every step the harder path and who now saw it through to the end. And as the chamber emptied, the world watched, and history turned a page. The ripple of the truth spread faster than the storm of lies that had come before it. As the chamber emptied and J.D. Vance stepped away from the podium with quiet resolve. The world beyond those walls had already begun to shift. The headlines that had for days painted him as a villain now changed in real time. The weight of the evidence too great for spin or doubt. In capital cities across the globe, statements began to pour in. Some measured, some swift, but all acknowledging the undeniable. Leaders who had once watched from the sidelines, unsure how to position themselves, now found their voices. The Prime Minister of a major European nation issued a terse declaration. It is clear that falsehood has no place at this table of nations. We call upon those responsible to answer for their actions. Others followed, some naming Traoré directly, others speaking in the language of diplomacy but with meaning no less sharp. A coalition of African states, once silent out of loyalty or caution, called for a full inquiry and, in whispered corridors, began discussions of Traoré's resignation. The protests that had raged against JD, against America, against perceived injustice, now turned on a new target. Outside the summit, banners that had accused JD of imperialism were lowered, replaced by hastily made signs that read, "No to betrayal," and "Traoré, lead to us." Crowds that had once chanted for JD's downfall now demanded answers from the man who had used them, who had fed their hopes with falsehoods and weaponized their pain. The chants were no less fierce, but now their fury was aimed at the one who had manipulated their trust. Inside the summit walls, the change was quieter, but no less profound. Allies who had kept their distance now returned, not with grand gestures or speeches, but with small, meaningful acknowledgments. A hand on the shoulder, a nod of respect, a quiet word exchanged in passing. JD noticed it all, not because he craved their approval, but because he understood what it meant. The path of integrity, though lonely at times, had brought them back. One of the European ministers who had challenged him days before found him in a quiet corridor, away from cameras and crowds. His expression was weary, but there was relief in his eyes. "You chose the high road," he said, his voice low but sincere, "and it saved us all." JD inclined his head, accepting the words without pride, only with the steady awareness that doing what was right had been worth the cost. The summit itself, so close to collapse days before, now began to regain its footing. Discussions resumed, agreements tentatively revived, the work of diplomacy inching forward once more. But beneath it all, the shadow of what had occurred remained. A reminder that truth, though sometimes slow to rise, could still light the way. As JD returned to his quarters that night, the noise of the world softened, replaced by a quieter hum. The sound of a storm passing, of a world beginning, however uncertainly, to heal. He knew the work was far from over, but for this day the truth had stood, and that was enough. The storm that had once gathered at Traoré's command now turned against him with a swiftness that few could have predicted. The man who had stood at the summit podium with fire in his voice, who had wielded accusation as a weapon, found himself abandoned by the very forces he had sought to control. By nightfall, the calls for his resignation were no longer veiled in diplomatic language. They were direct, undeniable, and deafening. Traoré left the summit under cover of darkness, slipping from the grand chamber not with the dignity of a statesman, but with the furtive haste of a man who knew his time had ended. Cameras caught fleeting glimpses, a lowered head, a guarded expression, the hurried steps of a figure once so sure of his place in the world. His departure was no grand exit, it was an escape, and the world saw it for what it was. As the truth continued to spread, the foundation of his power at home began to crumble. His allies distanced themselves, issuing statements of shock, of betrayal, of disavowal. The people who had once cheered his name now filled the streets, demanding accountability, demanding change. The web of lies he had spun so carefully unraveled thread by thread, leaving him exposed and alone. Meanwhile, the attention that had once burned so fiercely on J.D. Vance followed him as well. Reporters clamored for interviews, for statements, for reactions. They sought his voice, his reflection, his victory speech. But J.D. offered none. He moved quietly through the closing hours of the summit, declining cameras, deflecting praise, allowing the truth itself to be the only voice that mattered. When finally pressed by an aide as to why he would not speak, why he would not seize this moment to claim the narrative, JD's reply was simple, spoken with the quiet certainty that had guided him through the storm. "We are guardians, not kings." The words settled over those who heard them, not as a soundbite for the evening news, but as a reminder that the work of truth is not to rule, but to serve. That honor comes not in triumph over another, but in the steadfast defense of what is right. Behind him, the summit began the work of repair. Delegates who had feared collapse now found cautious hope. Talks resumed, tentative agreements were rejoined, the fragile threads of cooperation slowly rewoven. The world, bruised by the storm of deceit, turned its face once more toward the light of possibility, and JD, for his part, walked that quiet path between duty and humility. The fight had been bitter, the cost heavy, but he knew that the true measure of this victory was not in headlines or applause. It was in the restoration of trust, the reaffirmation that truth, when held with care, could endure even the fiercest storm. Outside, the city breathed easier. The chants that had filled its streets faded into the night, and as the first stars appeared in the clearing sky, J.D. Vance carried with him not the weight of a conqueror, but the quiet strength of a man who had stood his ground and let the truth speak for itself. Night had fallen fully now, the city beyond the summit walls hushed, as if the world itself were pausing to take a breath. J.D. Vance stood alone in his quarters, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. The weight of the past days, the storm of accusation and revelation, had settled at last, and yet the silence did not bring emptiness. It brought space, space to think, to feel, to understand what had truly been fought for. J.D. moved to the window, looking out over the quiet streets below. The protests were gone now, the crowds dispersed, their voices no longer raised in anger or fear. The city seemed at peace, but J.D. knew the work of peace was only just beginning. He watched as the lights of the city flickered like distant stars, each one a reminder of the lives touched by the choices made within these walls. The fight was never about him, J.D. thought, his reflection faint in the glass. It was about the world we leave behind. He turned away from the window and sat at the small desk in the corner of the room. A leather-bound journal lay open before him, the pages blank, waiting. He picked up his pen and paused, gathering his thoughts, letting the stillness guide his hand. And then he wrote, the words flowing not as a speech or a statement, but as a quiet promise to himself. The cost of truth is high. The cost of silence is higher. He set the pen down gently, reading the words back as if weighing them. They were simple, but they carried the full measure of what this battle had meant. Truth had demanded patience, sacrifice, the courage to stand alone when the world rushed to judgment. But it had also delivered, not victory in the sense of conquest, but victory in the sense of clarity, of justice served without bitterness. J.D. closed the journal, his fingers resting for a moment on its worn cover. He thought of those who had stood with him, those who had doubted, those who had watched from afar. He thought of the future leaders who might one day face storms of their own and wondered if his choices would help light their path. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, a soft sound that reminded him of home, of nights long ago when he had stood with his grandfather under the wide Ohio sky, learning what it meant to be strong without being hard, to be firm without being cruel. The room felt lighter now, as if the storm that had weighed on him had finally passed, leaving behind not emptiness, but peace. J.D. rose from the desk and returned to the window, watching as the first stars pierced the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions. But tonight, J.D. Vance allowed himself a moment of quiet certainty, that he had chosen rightly, that he had let truth speak for itself, and that, in doing so, he had honored not just his office, but the people and principles he served. And as he stood there, alone but at peace, the city below slept, and the world turned, a little closer to the light. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. Across the United States, from city streets to rural crossroads, people watched, read, and spoke of what had unfolded. For days, the nation had held its breath as J.D. Vance stood accused, isolated, and tested. Now, with the truth revealed and the storm weathered, there came a collective exhale, a release of tension that felt like pride, relief, and something deeper. Renewed faith in what steady leadership could mean. The headlines that had once screamed scandal now spoke of courage, of restraint, of honor in the face of fury. In coffee shops, in union halls, in kitchen table conversations, in quiet moments between neighbors, Americans reflected on what they had witnessed. It wasn't triumph in the way of flags raised or enemies defeated. It was something quieter, something stronger. A reminder that integrity could still light the way, even in the darkest of storms. JD felt that shift not in grand gestures or declarations, but in the quiet places where real life went on. He traveled, as he always preferred to do after great trials, not to the centers of power, but to the heart of the country. In a small town along the Ohio River, he walked among veterans gathered outside the local hall, their nods wordless but full of meaning. He shook hands with factory workers changing shifts, their grips firm, their eyes meeting his, not with fanfare, but with respect. On a farm at the edge of town, he paused to speak with a family mending a fence, their simple thanks carrying more weight than any speech. No cameras followed him, no headlines tracked his steps, and that was as he wanted it. This was not a time for applause. It was a time to listen, to understand, and to remember why the fight for truth had mattered. The storm had tested him, but it had also tested the nation, and together they had endured. Far from the halls of the summit, far from the offices where history is written in ink and signatures, a civics class gathered in a modest schoolroom. The teacher, a man who had served in local government before turning to the classroom, dimmed the lights and queued up the recording of J.D. Vance's address. The moment when he had chosen calm over fury, truth over spectacle. The students watched in thoughtful silence, their faces lit by the glow of the screen. They saw the weight of the accusations, the storm of outrage, the moment J.D. had stepped to the podium and let the truth speak. When the video ended, the room remained quiet for a beat longer, as if the lesson needed a moment to settle. A boy near the back raised his hand, his voice hesitant but hopeful. "Could I do that one day?" The teacher smiled, not with the easy smile of someone dismissing a dream, but with the steady warmth of someone who believed in it. "Courage isn't born," he said. "It's chosen, and it's chosen in moments just like that." The class nodded, some thoughtful, some inspired, all a little changed by what they had seen. The lesson wasn't just about J.D. Vance. It was about what integrity could look like, how it could endure, and how it could belong to anyone willing to choose it. The sun rose slow and sure over Washington, its light spilling across the marble columns and stone steps of the Capitol. J.D. Vance stood alone at the edge of that dawn, watching as the city came to life beneath the soft glow of morning. The battles of the past days felt distant now, not forgotten, but at peace. He reached into his pocket and touched the small steelworker's pin he always carried, a reminder of where he'd come from, of who had taught him the value of strength forged in the fire of trial. As the sun rose higher, the pin caught the light, glinting like a promise renewed. J.D. breathed deep, the air cool and full of possibility. The world would move on. New storms would come. New tests would rise. But for this moment, there was clarity, a stillness earned through struggle. He thought of the note he had written, folded close to his heart during the darkest hours. "If I fall tomorrow, let it be for what's right." And he knew now that he had not fallen. He had stood, not for himself, but for the truth, for the idea that honor mattered, that integrity could still guide the way. As the city stirred, as the day began, J.D. turned from the dawn, ready to face whatever would come. And in his final quiet thought, unspoken but steady, was the truth that had guided him through it all. Not for applause, for what's right. This story reminds us that true leadership is not measured by applause or victory speeches, but by the courage to stand for what is right when it costs the most. J.D. Vance's quiet strength in the face of lies, his refusal to answer fury with fury, and his commitment to let truth speak for itself show that integrity still matters in a noisy world. It's a powerful reminder that the hardest battles are often fought within, between pride and patience, between the easy path and the right one. His journey inspires us to believe that even in times of great division, honesty and honor can light the way forward. Question for you. When have you seen someone choose integrity over applause, and how did it inspire you? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.